everybody. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm delighted this morning to welcome Dina Vargo. Dina has been a lover of history and not for nothing tricorn hat, she assures me, since dressing up as Betsy Ross for the nation's bicentennial. And we wish we had a picture of that, but we don't.
We may. It is just not available today.
After she moved to the Boston area, she became a docent for Boston by Foot, where she developed a penchant for writing offbeat hidden history walking tours. She's the author of two engaging and very informative books about Boston history, Hidden History of Boston, and the one we're going to talk about today, Wild Women of Boston, Mettle and Moxie in the Hub. A great title, by the way, Dina. So, Dina, first of all, just welcome. And thank you so much for taking time to visit the show today to talk about these wonderful stories about these amazing women.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I really enjoyed your book and learned a lot from it. Well, Dina, please, if you could start by telling us about the criteria you used to select the wild women that you profile in your book, because as you note in the introduction to your book, Boston has more than its fair share of accomplished, brilliant, and daring women over the years. What are the women that you decided to feature in your book have in common?
Okay, well, for one thing, I wanted to include women that you probably haven't heard of before.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure to not include Abigail Adams, for instance, and a lot of the suffragists, even though later I thought, well, maybe I actually don't know who these women are specifically, but or maybe they needed a little bit more, but that could be and is its own book, you know. So I really thought, would these women throw a brick through a window? You know, did they have that sort of, then I thought that may sound a little violent. So let's back that up. Are they spicy? Do they have some spice to them? Because certainly, you know, there are a lot of women who probably stayed in their lane and still did a lot of amazing things. But these were women who broke out of the boundaries of what was acceptable for women's behavior at the time.
Yeah.
And that was my criteria.
Yeah.
Spice
is a really good criteria, and they're all memorable stories. You know, the women that you write about do have a wide range. They range from people who did noble things outside their lanes to people who did pretty scandalous or troubling things outside their lanes. But all the stories are fascinating, and they all merit discussion. Today, you've chosen three of these wild women whose stories you'll share with us today. So let's start with Mary Patton, whose chapter is titled 19 and Pregnant. Give us a little background about the era that she lived in and the setup for her extraordinary adventure.
Oh, sure. So Mary Patton was born, depending on where you look, either in East Boston or Chelsea, but you get the sense somewhere up in that area. In 1837, and she was married to a ship captain at Old North Church in Boston in 1853. So at that time, there was a sort of a change in technology in terms of shipping or in terms of transport. A lot going on in the nation. Over in California, there's a gold rush happening. Prior to that, you know, the China trade had opened up and, you know, just like today, always looking to push faster, more, better. And so shipping had changed to create these clipper ships, which if you were taking an overland route from Boston or New York to California or Oregon or Washington, it could take as long as 8 months. Yeah. And or even doing the over the seaward route, which would be going from the East Coast all the way down past South America, Cape Horn, the south, the southern tip of South America, and then all the way up and around, which could again take 8 months. But these clipper ships could cut that time in half.
Mhm.
And at the time, just like today, or maybe even during like the 1960s with sort of like the race to the moon, or getting rocket ships out there, there was a lot of attention on who could do it fastest.
Yeah.
And so in Marblehead, there was a sea captain named Joshua Creasy, I believe, who had, set records on a ship actually made in East Boston named the Flying Cloud. And I think did that entire trip in like 80 days or something like that, just really. And so Joshua Patton and Mary Patton were kind of in that mix. He was one of the most popular, fastest ship captains
Mm.
of the era. And so that sort of sets the stage for the adventure and the drama that she became a part of in 1856, which was, and I can elaborate if you like, but
Yeah, no, but you've done a great job of setting. I mean, clipper ships are important in Newburyport because we're known as the Clipper City.
ah, I knew I wanted to get a seafaring story in there.
Yeah, but you've done a good job of setting the stage for, this passage, especially given the gold rush was incredibly important, and to do it as fast as possible was a huge deal. And so there was competition to find ways to be able to get there the fastest. And so that's great to kind of set the stage and compare it to like the race to get to the moon, which, is a contemporary kind of equivalent with, a lot of commercial implications for who the winners would be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so in July of 1856, there are actually three ships that are going to be leaving New York City at
Yeah.
about the same time and doing that route around South America and arriving in San Francisco. And so there's actually money changing hands. Who's going to
Yeah.
do it fastest? And Mary Patton and her husband, Joshua, the money's on them to do it.
Yeah.
And they leave New York City in July of 1856. And just like the other two ships that were leaving around the same time, hit one of the worst winters
Mm.
in the Southern Hemisphere. So July up here, summertime, wintertime
Yeah.
down there. And what happens is completely unfortunate to Mary and her husband. First off, they kind of get this assignment late in the game.
Mm.
They are assigned a first mate and a second mate they're not really familiar with. The first mate turns out to be just a player. Actually, whenever he's kind of put in charge, he's slowing the ship down.
Yeah.
So there's thoughts that maybe he put money on one of the other two
Yeah.
ships. So he's sent to the brig.
Mhm.
The second mate turns out that he's illiterate. He
Mhm.
may be, the skilled seaman, but he's not going to be able to set navigation or, really captain the ship. And
Yeah.
so Captain Patton has to just take over completely. And that's the time when they hit this terrible weather.
Mm.
He falls ill such that he gets something called brain fever, which I'm not exactly sure what the modern equivalent is, but
But
maybe pneumonia.
can't be good.
It's not good. He's, running a really high fever. He goes
Yeah.
temporarily blind.
Wow.
Mary goes to sea with him. And I should say, sort of set the stage there too, that she had choices. She could have stayed home. She could have run a business at home. And if we look at Nantucket, a lot of seafaring merchants down there, a lot of women ran businesses. There was Petticoat Row is the name
Mm.
of a portion of Main
Mm.
Street there because of so many women run businesses. And she opted to go on these journeys with her
Yeah.
husband. And in so doing, he would often teach her, they months at a time, right, that they
Yeah.
would have together. He taught her how to use a sextant, how to
Yeah.
use a compass, how to look at the stars to navigate, and admitted that she could indeed be a master mariner or a master navigator had she been a man,
Yeah.
because she was so skilled. So lucky for this crew, she's able to take over whenever her
Yeah.
husband goes down and navigates this ship through, again, terrible weather, patches of ice floes. And the second mate or the first mate who's actually in the brig makes a plea like, listen, I can help you out.
Yeah.
Turns out that he's actually trying to form a mutiny
Yeah.
amongst the sailors. She finds that out, takes over the ship again,
Yeah.
and has to have a talk with the sailors to say, we've got to do this together. You could go with the first mate, you could go with me. And the sailors choose Mary.
Wisely so.
Wisely so. And unbelievably, she's a 19-year-old
Yeah.
woman. And so, what was it about her? I
Yeah.
wonder, that like, I just think she's a kid, but they must
Yeah.
have had confidence in her abilities and her skills, because they may have known they weren't going to survive otherwise. So they wouldn't have made
Yeah.
port otherwise. But yeah, they put their full faith and backing in Mary,
Mhm.
and she piloted them right into San Francisco Bay.
It's such a remarkable story, and just to imagine the physical hardships of that time, even in good weather, Dina,
Right, right.
much less ice flows and a terrible winter, and the fact that your husband is ill, and that you have a saboteur on board that you have to keep in the brig, and so it's such a dramatic story. And you talk about, these are, I think you used the phrase hard scrabble,
Yeah.
seafaring sailors, and the fact that
Yes.
they would choose, that they would, work under her supervision suggests to me a couple of things. One, she must have been clearly it must have been clear to them how knowledgeable she was, and that she had the mettle and the moxie
Absolutely. Yes.
to pull this off. And I imagine there must have been some kind of authoritative presence, but one that wouldn't have been threatening to them, but one that would have been inspiring to them. So one wishes one could have met her.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, sadly, she had such a short life.
Yeah, I noted that. I think it was tuberculosis.
Right, right. She was 24 years old.
And
Um,
her husband died before her, didn't he?
yeah, he didn't make it much longer after
Yeah.
this trip. They
Hmm.
made it back to Boston, and
Yeah.
he was laid to rest maybe 6 weeks later, I think, or 6 months later. It was a short time.
Yeah.
And actually, what I forgot to mention is that not only did Mary, do all of this, but she was, as the title suggests, pregnant. You know?
Right. That's right.
So
All the which just makes her more amazing.
exactly, yeah, yeah.
Imagine morning sickness at sea.
Oh gosh, it's a double whammy.
I know. So what a remarkable person.
Oh,
It's really such an amazing story.
yeah, yeah,
Um, well,
yes,
the second wild woman
yeah,
that you talk about, that we decided you would talk about today, is Sarah Parker Remond,
yeah.
whose chapter is titled Proto Rosa Parks. So tell us about the era that she lived in and conditions for free blacks, including free blacks such as Sarah Parker Remond, what conditions were like in New England, and the setup then for her Rosa Parks moment, although it's arguable that Rosa Parks is the one who had a Sarah Parker Remond moment
That is very
sometime
true.
later. So tell us about her.
So Sarah Parker Remond grew up in Salem, so another North Shore story, and I think Salem knows her story well. Um, thank goodness, I'm glad for it. And actually, her family, she grew up as a free black, as you mentioned. Her family were, I think, hairdressers and caterers, so they owned their own businesses up in Salem, and sort of became involved. I think they were a family of activists.
Hmm.
And they wanted their children to be educated. And Salem had private schools, public schools. And whenever Sarah and I think her sister were old enough to go to the high school, um, they passed the test, whatever entrance exam there might have been. And Salem then made the decision to segregate the schools.
Hmm.
And so the Parker Remond family decided that's enough for us. They moved to Newport, Rhode Island, where they could educate their children. But they eventually moved back to Salem and actually were able to sort of help Salem see the wisdom of its ways. And I believe Salem became the first city or town in Massachusetts to desegregate its public schools, and as early as the 1840s. Um, at this time, women, just women at large, white women and Black women, were, maybe not educated in colleges like they would be a couple of decades later, but were able to read and write at least at home, and educated themselves and started to organize themselves in the abolitionist movement. Um, and so they're sort of actually taking a big role in it was really like leaders. I mean, like William Lloyd Garrison and other men usually get a lot of the attention. Obviously, they're writing newspapers, and they have a bigger reach, a bigger pull. But who's doing the work on the streets or on the ground? That groundwork is women everywhere.
It's an old story.
Story. It's a common story.
Yeah.
You could talk about it today. So much still going on like that, and so she's able to start to lecture. Her brother is a lecturer because, no internet, no television, no radio at the time. So how did people get their information? By going in person to see lecturers or give sermons or pamphlets and books. That is the way information was disseminated. And so she joined her brother, who was sort of on the speaker circuit, and became a speaker for abolition. And she was able to talk about, as a Black person, the issues that she knew was going on in the South, and then become an advocate, obviously, for freeing slaves in the run up to the Civil War. So this is 1850s at this point.
Yeah.
And
then she had the proto Rosa Parks, or simply again, whether you call it proto Rosa Parks or rather Rosa Parks, had a moment that duplicated. Tell us about the theatrical experience that she had.
Yeah, so it's a terrible story. She went to the theater. It's the Howard Athenaeum in Boston, which I believe then later became the Howard Theater, which became like a burlesque theater later in the 60s, I think, the 50s and 60s. So if the name sounds familiar to listeners, then that it is familiar.
Yeah.
So she and her two friends had tickets to see a show, and walked into the theater as paying ticket holders, and were about to take their seats. And of course, Sarah is African American, and the management came and said, "Nope, don't care about your ticket. You will go into this other section." And there was a name for that other section that I will just not use here. It's in the book, but
we can use our imaginations.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not a pretty name. And so she was forcibly removed from her seat, and actually from the theater. And she decided to take a suit against the theater, and sue them for damages. They actually roughed her up. They tore her dress and hurt her shoulder, and she won.
Good for her. Good, and good for the courts as well.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. At that time, that could have gone any way, for sure. Yes.
But she wasn't going to take it.
She wasn't going to take it.
She was going to do something, and you have to really admire that spirit in any age, but especially during that era, pre-Civil War, pre-emancipation, for a Black woman to take on a theater and use the courts and to win in the courts, which must have been very satisfying. Not as satisfying as not having had to go through the experience, of course, in the first place, but having gone through it, shamefully enough for the theater, to be able to have some vindication, and to have the courts come down on her side. And what happened to her? Where did she wind up?
So
Dina?
she started to lecture in Europe,
Hmm.
so really in England, again, prior to the Civil War, because the states that would become the Union needed the support of Britain
Yeah,
at some point, and they had already abolished slavery in England.
yeah,
And but it was good to go over to Europe and spread the word and gain support. And it's just an amazing story to be a woman, like a single woman, an
mhm,
independent single woman, a Black independent single
yeah,
woman going overseas. I mean, not just
yeah,
going to New York and, or Albany or or Worcester
right,
to do, which is in itself an accomplishment to
yeah,
just, get on a stagecoach and
hmm,
do these things yourself. Actually goes to Europe and starts making speeches all over Britain. Um, and she was, incredibly popular lecturer over there.
hmm,
She came back to the United States after the Civil War. Just like spent the Civil War over in Britain, over in Europe. Came back and determined that it was just too racist a space for
yeah,
her to live in. Um,
mhm,
then wound up going to Florence, becoming a doctor,
yeah,
and then spending her days in Rome. And she is actually buried in Rome. So it just like, wait a second, she becomes a lecturer and then a physician who, yeah, lived,
yeah,
an accomplished on so
yes,
many levels woman.
yeah, and
Just,
and then lives out her life in Florence and
yeah,
Rome.
yeah.
Not too shabby places to live, by the
No, not at all.
way.
Not at all.
But although she shouldn't have had to, she should have been able to do those things and become a physician here. It's
Right.
just a remarkable life story.
Yeah,
So,
it is. And
well,
yeah.
yeah, no, go ahead, go ahead. I
Well, I
didn't
was
mean to
just
interrupt you.
thinking actually just that even if she'd come back to the United States, she still wouldn't have been able to be a physician. It wasn't until the Blackwell sisters
Right.
became physicians, and I'm sort of forgetting the year that happened. So,
Yeah, I
but
forget
it's
too, but it was a lot longer than it ever should have been.
absolutely.
So, she would have two strikes against her being African American and being a woman.
Yeah, yeah.
Where you could do those things in Italy, which is, yay for Italy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, there's a third story that you're going to share with us today. Harriet Hemenway and her co-activist Minna Hall. Please tell us the background of what made them decide that they were going to take down a multi-million-dollar industry and the amazingly effective strategies that used to do so.
Yeah, so Minna Hall and Harriet Hemenway, these are two women who didn't have the hardscrabble lives
Yeah.
of Mary Patton or Sarah Parker Remond. They were born into elite society, born privileged. And you know what I love about them? They're going to use their privilege for good, which
Yeah.
a lot of women did at that time. A lot of women, reformers and activists in those years after the Civil War. Um, let's go to like the 1880s to the early 1900s. So these are women who have money, they've been educated, they may have gone to college. Harriet Hemingway's, she was actually a Lawrence. So her
uh,
maiden name is Lawrence. So her father's Amos Adams Lawrence. So as, one of the
as in,
mill owners, the
yeah,
city builder up in Lawrence,
yeah.
Massachusetts, he himself was, well-to-do, but put his money where his mouth was, believed in the abolitionist cause prior to the Civil War, believed in like the free, what is it? Oh, free soilers over in
Mhm.
like Kansas and
Mm.
and in Missouri, as those states were sort of toggling between whether they would be free
Yeah.
states or slave states. So Lawrence, Kansas is named after the same family. There's a Lawrence College in
Mm.
Appleton, Wisconsin.
Oh,
Same family because they were related to the Appletons. So
oh,
also intertwined and related.
mhm.
And so, Harriet Hemingway is brought up in this culture of 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 activism and really, yeah, using that privilege for good. And it is a day in the 1890s, 1896, I want to say, that she is reading a newspaper article that is describing the decimation of an entire rookery of herons and cranes and other birds in the Everglades in Florida. And the newspaper article probably included graphic photographs of dead birds, that had been stripped of their feathers, and probably baby birds that were dying of starvation, right? Because their parents had been killed. And they were killed for their feathers.
Yeah.
Because their feathers drove this multi-million-dollar industry of putting feathers in women's hats.
Yeah.
And for years, that was the fashion.
Mm-hmm.
It was very popular to sort of, I don't know, this express a sort of interest in the natural world in this very odd way.
Yeah.
It's kind of odd to think about conservation and nature by denuding birds of their feathers so that you could show them off. But at the time, there may be, there was a man who stood on a street corner for 2 days in New York City and noticed 44 species of birds.
Wow. Yeah.
And their feathers in hats. And there could be an entire little nest in a hat, little mice, taxidermied, the whole shebang in their hats. And so Harriet and Minna, being a part of the elite in Boston, call their friends, just like we would do, right? You're going to text your friend, get on your phone, and I just read this article, and they just start to have coffees and teas and start to think, like, what can we do to stop this from happening? And there had already been an effort put together by scientific men that just wasn't gaining traction. And I really think about this in terms of, like, we all know the facts and figures in terms of, like, climate change right now, but that might not move me to recycle. However, seeing a baby polar bear on an ice floe in the middle of nowhere is going to make me open my wallet, right? Like that's going to get me every time. And so that becomes a part of Minna and Harriet's strategy, is to sort of appeal to the heart as well as the head.
Yeah.
And also start to appeal to other women. And not just their elite friends, but let's grow this, another grassroots sort of groundwork building effort. Let's talk with working class women and convince them to stop wearing feathers in their hats. Let's talk to teachers who are largely women and get them to teach children about conservation and appreciation of animals and nature. Let's do more to, or even appeal to other elite women who are still wearing the feathers in their hats, like Helen Taft did in the inaugural parade whenever her husband became president. And, Minna Hall and Harriet Hemenway were on top of that. Once they saw Helen Taft with feathers in her hat, they wrote her a letter and said, "You shouldn't be doing that. No more, please." So they worked at this for years, became board members of this new organization, and that organization was the Audubon Society. So they started chapters in states and chapters, like I think like in localities, and then grew into states, and then grew into a national organization, and got legislation passed in Massachusetts, and then nationally, and then internationally, to just stop the decimation of bird populations all across America, and wound up taking down a multi-million-dollar a year industry in the process.
Yeah, and it's also an interesting study in what seems grotesque and ecologically disastrous to one time can seem like desirable fashion to another. And so it makes you wonder about some of the things that we do that future generations will go, "Oh, can you believe?" But just it's very effective strategies that they were able to use. And they use, as you said earlier, they were of an elite class, but they used those connections then to do good. And it gave them
Yes.
a kind of a clout and credibility that they might not otherwise have had. And one of the other things you talk about is how they kind of recognized that at the time, as women, they knew they would have to enlist men to gain additional credibility if they were going to have laws passed.
Absolutely.
And so they were able to loop into their network, in addition to the wide network of women, that they also recognized that they should get some male scientists involved, and also have them kind of give testimony and be witness to the devastation. Um, it's hard to imagine how many millions of birds' lives they saved. You
That is
know,
true. Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
person, because there were, I mean, you see some pictures of some of the hats people were using with, as you were saying, whole birds, and it just, for us to see them today, it would just break your heart to think about, really, and for what? For fashion. So they were pretty
Yeah.
amazing women, and you told their story very well today, as you do in your book.
Thanks.
I used to work for Drumlin Farms and Audubon Sanctuary in
Oh,
Lincoln.
sure. Yeah.
So I had heard about them because in our children's book library there, we had a children's book about Harriet Hemenway and Minna Hall, and how they were basically the driving force behind Mass Audubon being formed. But I think not enough people know about them. And there's so many cautionary tales about fashion, about trends, about impacts that we might know about on wildlife, of our everyday behaviors. And
Yes.
so I appreciated your choosing them as two of your wild women.
Thanks.
Well, Dina, these are wonderful stories, and you tell them in a wonderful way. Why is it important that the stories of these women be told, that they become better known, and that they become part of our historical record?
It's so interesting. I was sort of thinking back to Mary Patton. I feel like women, and I would say at least women my age, I'm not sure about younger women, I feel like we don't take enough credit
Hmm.
um, for the work that we do. And so I'm thinking of Mary Patton, who, pilots the ship into San
Yeah.
Francisco Bay, and the insurers met her, and like, they could have lost a lot of money if she had to take that ship into another port, or if it became lost at sea. She didn't just do something amazing. She saved a lot of money for a lot of people, and a lot of people
Yeah.
made money. And so they present her with a check for $1,000, which is a boatload of money at that time. And no pun intended on the boatload comment.
It's all right.
Yeah, no pun intended. But she just said, "Oh, it was just my job, just
Yeah.
just doing what you got to do." And I think that's great. And maybe maybe it's a little bit true, but I feel like so many things that women have done have really been lost to history because we haven't really put a stake in the ground to claim that we did this
Yeah.
ourselves. And it's just, you find these pictures of a group of older men, whatever, maybe they're not older, I don't know, but a black and white picture of guys. And, they're all labeled this, who's
Yeah.
who. And how many pictures of women I've run into? No names. We don't
Yeah.
know who they are. Someone please identify these people, right?
Yeah.
And there it is. It's just, I really do feel that women need to take credit where credit is
Yeah.
due. And, so often we do share credit. It's hard to do a job interview whenever you're sharing credit. It's just, I don't know. I think we need to learn some lessons from these women, that we need to own our successes.
But it's interesting, Dina. Recently, I had the opportunity to interview an historian named Catherine Landeck, who wrote a book called The Women with Silver Wings. She was here in Newburyport for the Literary Festival recently, and she tells the story about the women's Air Force service pilots, who were incredibly important in helping us win World War II. And I asked her the same question: why does it matter that we learn, who these women were and what they did? And she made the same points that you did. That, and she also added something I thought was very interesting. She said, girls and young women need to know. Their imaginations have to open up to the possibilities, because we're all affected by history, what's known and what's not known, what's bragged about and what remains secret and behind the scenes. Because she made the point that there are only 7% of pilots today are women. And
Wow,
there
right.
actually were more than that in the 1920s and 30s, which is why they had a pool of women pilots to draw upon when World War II came.
That's crazy.
So I think,
Wow.
and, your points are well taken, and I think they also help to open the imaginations for girls and young women about what the potentials are, what you can do if you have the mettle and moxie to do so.
Absolutely. I
So,
agree. 100%. Absolutely. Yes.
and I wanted to add a note that since, because your book came out a few years ago,
Yeah.
and when and Sarah Parker Remond has actually gotten some of the attention she well deserves that you gave her earlier on. She's currently featured in an exhibit at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, of course, and that exhibit is titled "Let None Be Excluded: The Origins of Equal School Rights in Salem," and it's on display. You can go see it still. It's on through April of 2024. And this exhibit draws upon the work of a Newburyport native, or
Right.
a Newburyport resident, not native, but Cabria Baumgartner, who wrote a book called In Pursuit of Knowledge, which discusses Sarah Parker Remond as among the Black girls and women, as you talked about, who fought for education equality in Salem and led Salem to reintegrate their school system. I wanted to ask you, when you have been telling us so much. There's one more thing I want to ask you about before we finish up today,
Yeah,
because you
sure.
talk in the book, Dina, about the Boston Women's History Trail, and which I wasn't really aware of. And I hope that you might say a little bit about the trail, the territory it covers, and some of the featured women.
Oh my goodness. As it turns out, there are multiple trails through multiple
Oh,
neighborhoods. So you can go to their website and do a self-guided tour.
okay.
Um, and I think that's been actually, I just met one of the women who founded the trail last
Oh,
night. And it was as complete happenstance. But yeah, it's so interesting. Like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. But so I think they have 16 different trails, something like
wow.
that, through many,
Okay.
many neighborhoods. So, but you could take a stroll through Beacon Hill, the Back Bay. Obviously, there's the statue, the three statues of Abigail Adams, Lucy Stone, and Phyllis Wheatley. Go
Mhm.
through there. Harriet Hemenway may be on one of the tours as well. Um, gosh, I'm kind of, what am I blanking on? But just, yeah, check out the website. That's
Yeah.
a treasure trove of information and a ton of hard work by a lot of women.
Mhm.
And actually, Boston by Foot was partnering with the Women's Heritage Trail to do some of their tours, to help guide some of those tours with them or on their behalf.
Mhm.
So you can always check out the bostonbyfoot.org website,
Okay.
and they always have some really good tours popping. So, yeah,
I bet. And are you currently researching or writing anything?
I wish that I was. I'm not right now, but you never know. I always have bunches of ideas, and
Yeah.
so at this point, just maybe doing a couple more talks. Probably not until the fall, but yeah, if I do, you'll be the first to know.
Keep us posted. We'll have you
Yes, I
back.
will. Yeah,
And I believe you have a website where people can learn more about your books and your
yeah,
research.
yeah. DinaVargo.com.
There you go.
DinaVargo.com. Yep.
Easy to remember. Dina, I can't
Yeah.
thank you enough, both for Wild Women of Boston and for taking the time to come and share your excellent storytelling abilities with us today, and to help make sure that these amazing women are better known. As we were talking about in an email exchange to prepare for this, all of these women would make wonderful films. They just
Absolutely.
cry out to be made into movies, and maybe there will be.
Yeah.
Send an email to Shonda Rhimes.
Oh my gosh, she would do a great job. Could you
She
imagine
would
the
do a
feathers and the
great
hat?
job.
Oh my gosh, Sarah Parker Remond,
Absolutely.
so up her alley. Yeah.
Bridgerton is nothing compared to
No,
Harriet, Hemingway, and Minna Hall.
absolutely.
Once again, Dina, thank you so much. It's been a joy to talk to you. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your storytelling ability with us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I do
My
hope we get to do it again someday.
Yes, I hope so. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, be well.